I'm back. I don't know what happened. Today, of all days, there were some problems with internet, but I'm glad that it didn't terminate the whole meeting. So I was terrified. Terrified. Okay, does anyone want, James, you want to comment on Block? And putting him on the spot? And we can't hear you, well, unless you want to say something, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's strange, the idea that the political resistance is not the political poetry, and also that the obviously political historical poetry is something that's also beside the point and also has consequences in the Soviet state, either way, unless you're writing a poetry of the state. And I think that's the political resistance that Shama was talking about, because it wasn't poetry of the narrative that Lenin and Trotsky were trying to create. It was their own symbolist. So it was political resistance, without a doubt, and not in the sense that it was towing the Soviet line. And then everything changed so fast. There were so many poets back then who were excited about the revolution and had pinned a lot of hopes on a different kind of world and met like this terrible fate because of it.
Thank you.
I thought it was great.
Well, thank you. Shall we, how do we feel? Shall we move on? Shall we take a break? No break yet.
First, I want to thank you for your
Michelle.
patience and for your suggestions and questions. And I have to read Tsvetaeva about Voloshin, and thank you. And look at Akhmatova's notes about Block, the late Block, to know more. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on now. Then let's move to James Todd, whom I just brought to unmuted just in time. He's a very talented poet from Boston, Massachusetts. I'll highly recommend him to all of you. How many books have you brought out? Are there more incoming?
I have 2 books of poetry and a 3rd one coming out next year.
Okay, brilliant. James Todd's. What are they called? Your first 2 books of poetry?
Yeah, so the first 2 books, they've both been published by Pen and Anvil Press, which is out of Boston University. They are Since and Elgin Pelicans.
And James started a MA degree from Boston College, but then interrupted his, like Brodsky interrupted his school. So he's stepping in Brodsky's steps. He's been to Nordinsky, to the Arctic Circle, and was to Venice. So he's very much sort of has a great in-depth understanding of Russian literature, which is rarely met on university campuses, and only can be a matter of personal passion. And so, do you have a PowerPoint, or are you just gonna give a talk? Yeah. Okay. He's gonna give his talk.
Cool. Thank you, Zach.
Not at all.
My paper is called The Curtain as Spectacle, Deconstructing the Dramatic Narrative of Soviet Censorship from the West. And I'll start with a poem by Akhmatova, Последний тост. Я пью за разоренный дом, за злую жизнь мою, за одиночество вдвоем и за тебя я пью. За ложь меня предавших губ, за мертвый холод глаз, за то, что мир жесток и груб, za to, što Bog ne spas. And my translation, last toast. Here's to the ruin of this house, to the villainies we do, to our coupled severance. And here's to you, to the lies lips issued forth, to the cold weather of your eyes, to the world's being dumb and coarse, to God who passed us by. And that was written in 1934 at the Sheremetyev House on Fontanka in St. Petersburg. The Iron Curtain is a glass case. We stand outside it now. Joseph Brodsky was born in Leningrad in 1940, a child of the siege. As a young poet, he was championed by Anna Akhmatova, the matron or vanguard of the Silver Age. She had dedicated much of her life not just to her own work, but to the vast project of preserving the poetry of her generation through samizdat. It was an underground railroad of publishing and mnemonic caretaking, and one of the greatest achievements of Russian history when the Soviet state was bent on the end of history. Brodsky took on the mantle of heir to that generation. From exile in New York, he told that story, remaking the canon of the Silver Age. The endless performances of the exotic constitute the spectacle. They don't paint a flat picture, but something with far greater dimension that we cannot touch. Faithful reproduction and distance are juxtaposed. We are relegated to the audience. From the Russian context, I will add another key aspect of what constitutes the spectacle, the element of song and dance. 8 years ago, 5 members of Pussy Riot took to the altar in Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior in balaclavas to dance and cuss out the Orthodox Church and Putin in a punk prayer for an internet music video. The 21st century viral protest, a neo-Dada performance piece, landed 2 of the artists in jail with 2-year sentences. The formal charges were hooliganism, unbecoming or disorderly conduct, being oppositional, which is to say, staging a non-sanctioned spectacle. Nadezhda Tolokonnikova and Maria Alyokhina wrote from their jail cells, respectively, Pussy Riot are Vidensky's students and heirs. His principle of the bad rhyme is dear to us. He wrote, sometimes I think of 2 different rhymes, one good and one bad, and I always choose the bad one because it is always the right one. I would like to point out that very similar methods were used during the trial of poet Joseph Brodsky. When I read these letters that were smuggled out of prison and published, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. These punk feminists were not just claiming the inheritance of Brodsky and so Akhmatova. These were poets who had found their voices, rehabilitated in the course of the Soviet failure. Alexander Vidensky was a link that had fallen from the chain. Aberyu, a loose collective of radical Leningrad poets and philosophers gathering and performing before the war, were effectively broken by the state, censored, scattered, crushed. Harassed, many had taken to the typical alternatives of writing work in the 30s, publishing children's literature and translation. Their experiments in anti-poetry and absurdism were verboten. Their performances banned. The association was short-lived and unknown outside very small circles. almost as if they'd never existed. Wydiński's friend Daniel Harms was locked up in an asylum when the Nazis blockaded the city, and when it was abandoned by the officers, the inmates manuscripts.
Now, Irena wanted to say something.
No. I did not. I was very moved by this. I was very moved by this this talk, really. And I also remembered I have been at this Baryshnikov reading and dancing of performing of Brodsky's poems. And you described it in such a moving way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and somebody else wants to make a comment.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The only thing I want to say, if there are noises, people are cutting a tree outside of my window with big machines.
I don't hear them, but maybe somebody else can, or maybe it's good to unmute yourself.
Okay, I will let myself. Yes.
Okay, all right. Any other reactions, comments? Lars, Anne-Marie, Alexei, Alisa, Karen. Oh, Shama wants to say something. Let's Shama, mute yourself. Go for it.
It's thank you very much. I was very impressed as well. And it's not a question. It's just I think we can collect somehow. I don't know, words or semantics of the political. Like what came up in your reading was well, it was a political when you mentioned Pussy Riot or Putin. But it was also the absurd when you talked about Wydiński, and it was also about the private when you were telling your own story with this, and all these different words or concepts are part of the political. I was worried when I wrote my paper that it was not so much to the topic, but when I listen to you now, I realized that maybe we cannot even get out of the political, and that everything somehow encompasses this resistance or the political in general. I don't know. But I really liked your reading. Thank you. And especially the private aspect, which is so important for the political as well.
Yeah, well, Zach allowed me to write as an artist rather than as a scholar, so I was able to write a different kind of paper.
Yeah, we appreciate that. Alexei, you want to say something about the intersection between political and private?
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps not on the private part, but rather on the difference between the perspectives. You presented this, of course, from your own perspective, from the outside perspective. But did you read many books on the topic of the Soviet censorship from within, so to say? And what was your impression? What was the difference, so to say, between your impression, personal impression, and what you read about that from the other perspective, so to say?
Yeah, no, I've read a lot, and I studied Russian history almost 20 years ago. But I think sort of like Aden's impression that things are so alien from the West that it's hard to like understand the context kind of like naturally because it's so different. Is something that also happened with other poets who went and visited the Soviet Union, like Robert Frost, who like couldn't wrap his brain around it. And so it's something that I've been trying to wrap my brain around for all of my adult life. And yeah, so a poet like Allen Ginsberg really doesn't necessarily translate into the Soviet like experience, but there were poets like Frank O'Hara that were enamored of Mayakovsky and were able to like find a way of kind of like expanding the language of what political resistance could mean without being in a state where they weren't actively censored. And I remember I was in St. Petersburg once and I went to a reading by Sergei Gandiemsky. And after he was done, he was talking about writing sort of as an underground poet in the 80s and the 90s. And I asked him, well, so did you prefer to be writing there or to be in the place where you are now, where you're not hounded and harassed by the state and by censors? And he said, well, it's different. It's по-другому, because nobody cares about poetry here anymore either. So in Russia, the culture is kind of like losing a lot of that cult of the poet kind of characteristic at the same time as the state is no longer, they don't care about the poetry, but nobody does, maybe necessarily in a way that they're sort of like, they're just behind us maybe a little bit in that sense. That's how I always felt like after the fall of the Soviet Union, we're all coming into this like sort of large international global state where poetry has less relevance to politicians, but not to me.
Well, Stephanie wants to say something.
Yes, if I could say something, I want to apologize for being late, and now I want to apologize for needing to leave. We're competing for the Wi-Fi in my house, and I have to be off the Wi-Fi in 3 minutes. But I wanted to just make a quick point, which I look forward to, maybe we would discuss in the sessions later this week, to pick up on what James just said about the contemporary moment, the post-Soviet moment, and to invite us all to think about actually poets having, in fact, quite a different role from what Sergei Gandievsky was experiencing. Maybe it's generational, and maybe we could think about some of the younger poets who seem to me to have considerable followings, to be quite politically engaged, to be raising questions, particularly some of the women poets, raising questions about feminism and versions of the Me Too movement and sexual harassment and sexual violence, or poets who are writing about the war in Ukraine. I think of Yelena Fanailova, Maria Stepanova, others. I hope that we can pick up, though, on James's really wonderful suggestion of the importance of performance, both the ways that poets perform, the way that poetry itself is performed, or the kind of performance you were talking about, Baryshnikov, Brodsky, that performance which happened in New York. It feels to me like some very fruitful questions have been raised. And again, I apologize that I'm going to have to sign off very soon, but look forward to more conversations in the course of the week.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Did James want to respond to?
To the performative aspect? To me, it's different than just that the poetry was read by heart. But it had a sort of a, in the cult of the poet, it was shamanistic, right? And I still remember, like if you hear the recordings by these poets, they're sort of chanting and their poetry comes off as something that sounds so outlandish, and that you haven't heard it in English since like Tennyson maybe, where it's like this incantation where people like kind of go out of their bodies. And I think Brodsky maybe even got a little bit embarrassed of it at some point in his life, because he didn't, in one sense it was super impressive, and then in another sense it didn't necessarily have the impact of poetry to the people for whom they were just surprised by the fact that there was this big performance, because they didn't understand any poetry itself. And then the poetry in English was always read in the way that we recognize. But I wonder, because he wasn't doing it like as a show pony. And so to take somebody so far out of context, it would require like what I think was suggestive was like a concerted effort of a generation to change what poetry performance might be. And I wouldn't suggest that it is necessarily what we have, which is slam poetry, because that has the performance, but I think lacks a lot of what is the poetry itself.
What is the poetry itself? The density, the skill, the craftsmanship.
The skill and the craftsmanship, and also just sort of the way, so poetry slams work with performances being graded and ranked, which I think is demeaning and insulting for poetry reading. So that it's already like set up in a competition that I think I would dismantle all of that aspect of it before you could ever get something that I would want to spend a lifetime watching and following.
Okay. Anyone else wants to chip in? Shall we make a comment? Shall we like make 5 or 10 minute break? How are you feeling?
I see a raised hand.
Okay, let me see. And oh, Torsten, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, James, for this. One thing that occurred to me when I saw your title, The Curtain as Spectacle, and it kept recurring in your talk, was this, as you said, the difficulty of wrapping your mind around what Russia is like. And I was wondering, since you have a pretty unique way of opportunity of looking at Russia, both from the inside, having lived there, knowing the language, and from the outside, from the United States, do you feel that the Western perception and presentation of Russian literature, especially poetry, is like, and the circumstances of writing, is it sort of completely wrong, turning it to a spectacle of our own making, or do we somehow capture what is really going on and has been going on in the Soviet Union and Russia on this scene?
It seems to me like the understanding we have of the history of the Soviet Union is about right. Even if it's maybe that most people don't know a lot about it, and that, but what the poetry that was created out of it is something that I think that even the people who read it in English get very little sense of. And this would be something that I've read in papers by Zach about, but just because of the way that it's translated. And when you have poets like Mandelstam and Tsvetaeva, who was mentioned earlier, and Mayakovsky, who are like really highly experimental poets, almost everything we have in translation kind of narrows that and channels it and makes it look more like quiet lyric poetry, so that we really don't know what those poets were like if we just read them in the English translations. So I would say the poetry needs to be, it probably just is time to retranslate it all anyway, because most of this was done more than a generation ago. And with poets like Vidiensky and stuff, we have like this fuller idea of the literature that came out of Russia that Russians didn't know about and had to be reintroduced to them. But by people who didn't understand where it was coming from, because it all happened in the West and then got smuggled back into Russia. So now we have like a larger context that we didn't have until my lifetime, I would assume. But everything that we have that exists that we look at in order to understand these poets from the Silver Age is basically still that old generation stuff from the 70s and earlier.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Barry, wants to say something? Would you like to say something, make a comment? You've muted it.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
It's very nice talk, though, James. I did very much enjoyed it. I will say that. Just did a very, very wonderful job of linking, I think, the personal and the political in that presentation.
Thank you so much. Sorry for putting you on the spot, but this is my job, I guess. Thank you so much. Anybody else? Shall we take a 5 minutes break before we go to Poland? Or anybody else wants to comment on Alisa?
You spoke about 10 minutes. You said 10 minutes break.
Okay, let's do 10 minutes break. Now, okay, I have a clock here. It's 5 minutes past the hour. Let's reconvene at 15 minutes past the hour, whatever the hour is in your, okay?
I have to leave though, because I have pressing.
Yeah.
But it was good, and I'll try and catch some more of it later in the week.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us. And I'm really glad that so many people appreciated you here. Okay, so the next presentation going to be by Lars on Polish topics. So we will reconvene at 15. Are you still hanging in, Alisa? You're muted. Hello?
Yes, I'm enthralled. I just need another pot of coffee and then I'll be.
Yeah, so you have 10 minutes to do that. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So I can pause the recording. Yes.
As a matter of fact, I should have been speaking after Irena Gross and Alisa and also Leszek, because Krynicki belongs to a younger generation than those poets. Nevertheless, the little poem short poem I'm going to speak about was not published in socialist Poland at the time, but appeared in a book by Krynicki, Nasze życie rośnie, Our Life Grows, which was printed by the Exile Press Institut Literacki in Paris in 1978. An English translation of the entire book was published by our friend here, our colleague, Alisa Valles, in 2018. The text is very short. It reads, and I will ask Zachar to include the first picture, which shows the poem.
Oh, okay.
I guess you have prepared this for.
Yeah, no. Well, I've prepared, but here we go. So here's the first handout.
Yeah, first slide. Yeah, first handout.
So here we go. Share the screen. Yes.
Oh, The poem reads, jeżeli przyjdzie mi wykrzyczeć, niech żyje Polska, w jakim będę musiał to czynić języku. If you scroll down a bit, you'll see Alisa's translation. If it comes to the point that I shout, long live Poland, in what language will I have to do it? A reading of poetry demands active collaboration on the part of the reader. Any poetry. In modern Polish poetry after World War II, that is in the People's Republic, the context played a special role for a text to come alive. The reader was expected to be able to fill in, read between the lines, catch the subtle connotations. Here, I want to show how Ryszard Krynicki's short poem can be read in different contexts. The context of occupation, the context of exile, the context of language critique, the context of literary tradition. Ryszard Krynicki started out as a poet of the 1968 generation, writing often long Baroque rhetoric poems with anaphoric repetitions for reading aloud. The limits of language, the corruption of language in contemporary mass media and propaganda, and the silence as a counterforce were central themes of Krynicki's. In the 1970s, Krynicki turned from the long form to shortness, to the density that Zachar mentioned earlier, to elliptic shortness, writing haiku-like poems of so-called gnomic verses, an ancient genre recently, in fact, also used by the late American poet Robert Creeley. Krynicki's short poem, which we have in front of us, what does it refer to? Or could it refer to? That is, which were the contexts activated by the Polish reader in the 1970s, but perhaps not immediately clear to a foreign reader. And what are the contexts of the poem today? First, I guess we have to step back to the situation of the 1970s. The first context, the context of occupation. As we know, for 125 years, there were Poles, even if there was no Poland, contrary to King Ubu's famous words in Alfred Jarry's play. The theme of foreign invasion has a long tradition in Poland, and even after the World War II, Poland, not only in literature. And after the Second World War, Poland was threatened by Soviet occupation. Which language then should be used in order to make the invaders understand? In Czechoslovakia in August 68, the question became very concrete. When the Warsaw Pact armies invaded the country, people painted slogans in Russian on the walls. Cheering is normally directed to one's in-group, but its purpose is also to find understanding and agreement by others. But how to shout "Long live Poland" so as the occupant, the invader, could understand? Should it sound "Da zdravствует Polsha"? The second context is that the context of exile. The theme of exile and emigration has been and is the basis for the romantic idealist tradition of Polish culture and a key to understanding it. deportation, pilgrimage, martyrdom, nostalgia for the fatherland, utopian messianism, love-hate of the existing Poland or non-Poland, all this is connected with the conditions of exile. But what language should the Polish emigrant use if he wants to shout, "Long live Poland," and be understood in the streets of Paris, London, or Stockholm? Who on Boulevard Saint-Michel or on Karlavägen in Stockholm would understand Poles rallying for the freedom of its oppressed fatherland if they shout, "Niech żyje Polska"? In addition, Polish exile has always been a site for divergent views. Which Poland is actually worshipped? The ancient kingdom of Poland, the international symbol of fight for freedom, or the conservative, xenophobic country some people wanted to reconstruct the day they eventually were able to return to their homeland? Witold Gombrowicz has, like no one else, shown and parodied all the variants of Polish emigre discourse. Third context I would like to point out is the context of language critique. Let us say that the language Krynicki's poem is, is still Polish. Long live Poland. Niech żyje Polska. In what language will I have to do it? The question is, did there exist a Polish language in which this "long live" in 1975 could be pronounced in earnest? Ryszard Krynicki belonged, together with Stanisław Barańczak and others, to a group of poets called Generation 68, or the New Wave. A common point of departure for these poets was a strong criticism of official language corrupted by propaganda and of politicized mass media, and a demand for a literature that would give voice to everyday life, to the so-called unrepresented world, and which dared to call things by their real names. Krynicki's critique of language took different paths. One, the first, was that of linguistic play, with the Krakow avant-garde avant-gardist Tadeusz Piper in the background. The second was the satirical attack on official language, often by means of authentic quotations from the press, targeting cliches of the language of propaganda. The third part, Krynicki has pursued for many years now, the quest for an extreme, almost mystical purity of language, of moments, so to say, beyond public talk, to the limit of a silence to which Krynicki so often appeals. A fourth context, the context of tradition. Poland is one of the few countries where a modern poet, at least until recently, could address his or her fatherland in the vocative. In Krynicki's poetry, we find several examples of this, for instance, and I ask Zachar to show the second slide, the second handout.
One moment. Chwileczkę.
Yeah.
Okay, share screen. We'll go. Yes.
So the poem reads, czego się boisz? Polsko, Polsko, czemu ty, z której ust nie schodzi siła, tak bardzo się boisz tak bardzo się boisz słów, że konfiskujesz słowniki. Poland, Poland, why are you, whose lips never lose their strength, so afraid of words that you confiscate dictionaries? In the short poem I talk about here, the final line reads, in what language will I have to do it? Maybe we could go back to slide 1.
Let's go back to slide 1. Yeah.
But in the Polish original, there is a striking inversion. Krynicki says, w jakim będę musiał to czynić języku, instead of the unmarked, w jakim języku będę musiał to czynić. In which language will I have to do I have to do it? Like the appeals to the Poland, the fatherland, this stylistic figure, this inversion directs us to an older tradition, that of the Romantic 19th century. In Krynicki's work, one has already from the beginning heard often ironical echoes of the Polish bards, all from Adam Mickiewicz, and the famous words in his forefather's Eve, język kłamie głosowi, a głos myślom kłamie. The tongue belies all sound and the sound all thought, as translated by Dorothea Pralovady. The so-called gnomic genre, which Ryszard Krynicki has made his own. Yes, could we have the first slide again?
Absolutely. I just exited.
The gnomic genre, which Krynicki has made his own, was used by Mickiewicz as well as by other romantics, Julius Słowacky and Cyprian Norwid. In several poems after the introduction of martial law in Poland in 1981, Krynicki came close to the pathetic moral political intonation of the romantic bards. Here, if there's one specific romantic poet Krynicki refers to, it is probably Julius Słowacky. In a fragment from 1848, the people comes shouting, Polska, Polska, and the poet lets God appear in the burning bush asking, Jaka? Which one? So, Ryszard Krynicki's little poem, short poem, challenging the problems of patriotic discourse for a dissident in People's Republic of Poland, was written in 1975. I have tried to show in some different possible contexts, that of occupation, exile, language critique, tradition. With the end of so-called socialist Poland in 1989, and the victory for authenticity, democracy, and free speech, the end of state propaganda and censorship was coming to an end. And Krynicki's poem would seem to have lost some of its topicality, becoming part of recent history. But in today's Poland, unexpectedly for some of us, we see a new wave of propaganda and aggressive ideological purging of cultural and social institutions. The ideology is now clerical conservative, but the mechanisms are familiar for anyone who has lived in so-called socialist Poland. Adam Mickiewicz, a well-known political figure and writer, in his beautiful afterword to Alice Avala's translation of Krynicki's Our Life Grows, writes about the struggle for truth and justice of the 1980s. And he writes in the past tense. Today, however, Adam Michnik often says that Poland is threatened by a total Putinization of mass media and public discourse. So eventually, Ryszard Krynicki and his poetical critique of language, if anyone had forgotten it, has again become more vital than ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now, I would like to offer the floor.
Maybe, I would like to show here first is the
Życie różnie,
Życie rośnie, 1978, from Paris. And here is
Our Life Grows.
Alisa Valles' recent book translation, Our Life Grows. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Lots of, well, we haven't asked our audience yet, but it's like invisible. But we'll ask, we'll come to it. Well, who wants to leap at the can? Leszek, I see Leszek. Or no, Elena, Ellen. Does she does she want to? Can I unmute her? She's supposed to unmute herself. No, we can't hear you, Ellen. We can't hear you. Yeah, now
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And I think that the layers that you spoke about really elucidate the sense of the importance of these very compacted, very yet very piercing poems, and that we now have in Alyssa's translation finally in English, which is a great gift. I had a question actually for Irina, if she was willing to enter here, about the impact of hearing Ryszard's poetry at the time when it first happened, was first being published, what your responses to this work were at that time.
It was, he was the most striking among the new wave poets, because other poets, that is especially Barańczak and Zagajewski, and especially maybe Barańczak, they were much more explicit. They were very, in a way, they played on the fact, especially Barańczak, I would say, on the fact of being in a way in dialogue with the language of external politics, of the public language of Poland at that time. While Krynicki was very mysterious. You know, he was very cryptic and much more mysterious. I think the second poem here, and the translation of this poem would be an illustration of what I'm saying. I don't know, the second translation is also Alyssa's, yes or not?
No, I'm afraid it's my own.
It's your own. So this is the second line of that tradition, of this translation, is a kind of mistranslation that interprets, that kind of illustrates my talk, because to have something on your lips, so to say, in Polish, means talk about it. Why are you, whose lips never lose their strength? Czemu ty, z których ust nie schodzi siła? What nie schodzi siła, it means have something on your mouth, means to talk about something very often. and not to have, you know, your lips are, it doesn't mean your lips are strong.
No.
So this is in a way, this is what he was doing. He was like the other poets. He was taking the spoken language as the basis of his poetry, but he did it in a very, very cryptic way. Even though here you are very right, these are the poems that are so much imbued in the Polish translation, but these are like telegrams in a way. So you have to interpret them much more in a way deeply. So this is what was so characteristic about. I somehow felt, I don't know why I thought so. Maybe because Krynicki was also translating Brecht. This was kind of a non-Polish, non-traditional, while imbued in this romantic language, a non-traditional poetics.
Thank you. So how, just to make sure, how do you translate z której ust nie schodzi siła?
Who is always talking about power.
Who always talks about power.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's good.
Thank you very much, Irina. I'm sorry for this amateurish.
It's not criticism. It's just this.
No. Thank you. We'll do better next time.
I wanted actually to intervene in the middle of that mistake for a moment, because recently I was at a conference about the unexpected benefits of mistranslation. And I think that in a way, your translation makes the poem into a heroic Polish poem. And so perhaps there is something interesting in that. I wouldn't eliminate the translation. I think it needs to exist side by side with the other.
Yeah, I mean, it has to have lips in it. This is why I was also hesitant about, I would be hesitant calling it a mistake. It does have to have lips, but the meaning of the thing, the kind of the meaning on which it has to play is that you talk always about it, you know?
I wonder, Alisa, what about the translation? Maybe we could talk about that later.
Mine or yours?
Mine, my amateurish.
Well, to me, I mean, I haven't translated this poem, but to me, the challenge would be to come up with a translation of that line, which would include both meanings. Because I actually think that Krynicki wants them to be, he wants both of those meanings there. So you end up choosing one or the other. And
yeah, that's probably the task of the translator.
But this is why Krynicki's shortest poems are also the most difficult to translate, because it's there's as your beautiful presentation showed, you know, out of 3 lines, or in this case 10, you can draw a whole history of Polish literature, a history of the 20th century. I mean, that's what that density is doing. And this odd, what I love so much about Krynicki is this odd combination of reticence and confrontation. He has them both, these poems are both modest, reticent, shy, like Krynicki himself, and absolutely in your face, politically. And that seems to me their special genius. I mean, I don't know what brings you to these poems, but I also had the experience, I started working on these translations of mine, of Nasze Życie Rośnie, at a time when Poland was not in the situation it is now. And people asked me, you know, why are you translating these poems? Because the politics, the context of these poems has gone. And, you know, 10 years later, with Trump in office, you know, Krunitsky came to New York and he read some of these poems and he got these enormous laughs from the audience because they read them like they were written for us. A lot of the short poems about leaders and language just seemed absolutely spot on. But it remains a problem for a translator. I mean, you made me aware that I also failed in translating the last of 3 lines in Jeżeli Przyjdzie, in the sense that I don't get an echo. I don't get that slightly archaic sound, you know, that he does with the word order. And this is you know, my frustration with this book. I can't even look at the book anymore because I only see, and Krunitsky is like this too, when you know, when he sees his own books, he'll correct something, you know, 30 years later. So there's something about his engagement with language, which may, you know, I'm just beginning to think about this, trying to make the connection between Russian and Polish poets. His critique of language and its connection with his political, you know, his reticent political engagement. It seems to me crucial, just to state the obvious, that these 2 poems, like almost half of Krunitsky's poetry, they end with a question mark. That seems to me in itself, you know, a political statement and an important rhetorical statement, you know, because so much of political poetry, as traditionally understood and written in Poland and elsewhere, is a poetry of, you know, strong statements and, you know, resisting statements. Whereas Krunitsky discovers again and again that the most powerful critique of an authoritarian system is to ask a question and let it hang there. You know, it's the most destabilizing thing for an authoritarian language system. And I'm just spinning thoughts off all the rich material that you drew out of these poems.
Thank you, Alisa. Thank you. Yes, the question marks in Krunitsky are important. Thank you.
Anyone wants to say something? Raise it. Shama, go. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Thank you for this very subtle and interesting interpretation. I have a question to your approach in the beginning. You said that the reader was expected to be able to, I have the text here, I printed it because you uploaded it, so was expected to be able to fill in, read between the line, catch the subtle connotations. And of course we could say that is always necessary for a poem, and especially if we think about Russia, we have the Aesopian language concept that everywhere you try to fill in something which is maybe there, maybe not. So you try to catch the subtle political connotations and not only subtle connotations. And I was wondering what is special about Krunitsky compared to Russian poetry, which also is well, Aesopian. Is it that his form is so short that he writes so little? Because we also, as I said, when we read Russian poetry of the Soviet time or even before, we also try to fill in something and read the subversive in the poetry. And is Krunitsky's specialty or characteristic that it is so short that that it is even more difficult to fill in the missing semantic gaps?
Oh, thank you. Yes, of course, this is the poems of the 20th century written in Russia or in post-war Poland, or it's the Aesopic or not, but there is everything that is not said but could be understood. It's a task for the reader. I think Krunitsky drives this to the utmost in his elliptic poetry. which he's a master of of very few words. And I had the opportunity to work with him on translations when he was in Stockholm many years ago. In fact, Alisa, then he took the book Nasze życie rośnie, and he made a lot of corrections and stroke out words, lines, and we worked on the translations. He speaks German, so there was a third language, which is very good for to talk about a meta language for a discussion about translations. So we used German sometimes, and then he said with some mild smile, oh, fine, this will be, the next edition will be the new corrected and shortened edition of my poem.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
This was Wierzymski's poem. He said always like abridged and revised, never shortened. Revised should be shortened. I'm waiting for other reactions. Yeah, Leszek and Alexei, wonderful. First, Leszek, go for it. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
It is very difficult for me to formulate the question or the comment, but I am trying to figure out how this poem could be put in the contemporary Polish politics. Because if you ask, let's say, Kaczyński, in which language we should long life Poland, niech żyje Polska, he probably would say it is clear in Polish in the face of European Union, that we are still Poles in the European Union and so on and so on. And then it is very difficult for me to formulate this, but I am trying to think about this, how to say, ambiguity of Polish Romantic tradition, which is on other hand, on one hand, it is of course kind of a foundation of Polish identity, but on the other hand, it's very often going straight, is going to be used, this symbolism, romantic symbolism is going to be used in the very narrow nationalistic way, even if it is, of course, against this our great romantics and so on and so on. But anyway, it is something ambiguous, something strange, and I would say to some extent something dangerous. And then, you know, of course, at the time in 1975, it was like what you said in your presentation. But how we can use this now? Maybe different languages is something which help us to identify ourselves against this parochial narrow nationalist. This is the one remark. The second is, you know, there was the famous discussion at the beginning of 90s when Maria Janion, who died recently, said that finally Poles could end these romantic tropes which were used for 200 years as a kind of mode of communication, mode of resistance, and so on. Now we are becoming a normal nation, and romanticism is, of course, part of heritage, but it is not useful in probably I simplify her statement, but to some extent it is not so important, at least as used to be in oppressed Poland. And then I would say now there is a revival of this. I mean, these romantic tropes, these echoes, soldiers, and so on and so on. It is almost everywhere, and it is used, of course, against this probable intention of this our great romantics. But on the other hand, it is also, to some extent, kind of, how to say, ideologic, nationalistic ideology. So maybe this, the last line, speaking about different languages, is now has different meaning. It used to have in 1975, maybe even opposite, I am not sure. And of course, with second poem is much easier because it is just the same. If we speak about power and so on, why we would like to remove from our dictionaries whole vocabulary, let's say, of LGBT and so on and so on. So it is almost in the same way important as it used to be before.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
May I comment?
Yes.
Thank you, Leszek. Thank you for your comments, and also the former speakers. Thank you. Well, I'm not going to interpret or guess what Richard Krynicki would say today, but of course it's necessary to liberate the Polish romantics and the Polish, even the symbols of Polish patriotism, to be frank, from under the pressure of this clerical, reactionary clerical power, which is ruling Poland and destroying public institutions and so on. So maybe it's long live Poland has to be liberated from under the hands of Kaczynski and company.
Okay, thank you. Now, Alexei wanted to make a comment from Berlin.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is closely related to Shama's question, actually, on the more on the context of the existence and of the origin, the new origin of this very old poetic genre of gnomic verses, which is, I think, pretty narrow, and I would not identify this necessarily with Aesopic language, but it is an ancient genre which existed also in the medieval era, and also in not only in Europe but in the Islamic world, where it was also considered as some kind of heresy, a form of heresy, because of its aura of resistance against the political and religious mainstream. So my question would be, I think, pretty simple. Why were the 70s in Poland the ideal cultural, social background for the new found popularity of this genre? Or was this an accident, a result of a series of poetic experiments? Or was there also a personal belief that such kind of genre would have more social impact because of its brief character, for instance?
Thank you. In the case of Krynicki, I think one should no, he is also a translator himself. He has translated not only Brecht, as was mentioned, but also Paul Celan and Rainer Kunze, another German master of the very short poet. I'm not sure about the Polish tradition, if there's a Polish tradition of these gnomic verses, but it's rather a tradition of resistance to the rhetoric and to the squabble and to too many words, and have to go back to essential words. I had the pleasure to work on Leif Rubinstein's poetry also. I don't know if Leif is here with us, but it's quite different from Krunitsky. But Leif Rubinstein is also a master of the elliptic form, although it's there's chains of elliptic phrases in his poetry, but I think it was a personal experience by Krunitsky, and he went a different direction than all his friends in the same generation, to this extreme ellipticism, almost bordering to silence. Thank you.
Thank you. So, is anyone, Ellen wants to? Yeah, go. Go ahead.
I actually have questions for 3 people. This makes it a little bit complicated. First, I did want to ask about the possibility of a connection between Krunitsky and Celan, in which you've mentioned the impact. I don't know if you know historically any information about his discovery of Celan and his affinity and the extent of that. That was one question. I have a quite complex question for Irina that I hope, I don't mean to put her on the spot, but I'm aware that we have someone who is both a witness of history and a deep reader of poetry, and who would have been experiencing these texts as they were happening, but also in different conditions. And I had a very slightly complicated question about whether your needs as a reader were different when you were in Poland or when you were in exile yourself. And because we talk about the poet being either at home or in exile, but not about the reception of the reader. And my third question was for Alyssa, to tell us, at least maybe perhaps at the end, about your journey, about the experience of rendering these poems in English, since you've spent a lot of time working on it. But so those, Celan, readership in exile, and translation were my 3 questions.
I can answer shortly, very shortly. Celan, I think it's a very lifelong experience by Krunitsky, his interest. I remember he was in Stockholm in 1981, before the state of war was declared in Poland, in this time of solidarity. We talked about, and he talked very much about Celan, and he was also interested in Nelly Sachs, and we went to the library of Nelly Sachs and the cabinet in the Royal Library. And but Celan is a very long, serious, lifelong, I would say, company of Ryszard Krunitsky's. Thank you.
Okay, now to Irina.
Yeah, following on this, I think maybe Alyssa will know more about it. I'm not sure if I can talk about it. I mean, I don't have enough information about it, but I think that Ryszard Krynicki is very interested in the Holocaust issues, and that he was very much so maybe this is for Alisa to say. As far as the reading of it, I was already, when these poets were publishing, my contemporaries, I was already abroad because I emigrated after 1968. I found myself in the West by the end of 1969. And I read this differently, I'm sure. First of all, it was a miracle. I mean, it was really something extraordinary that they appeared, that they started, these poems, I remember the excitement, you know, and the pleasure of it. And the second thing is that I feel that I must have been less oppressed than they were by that language they were fighting against. So there was this little ambivalence on my part because I was not exposed daily at this kind of noxious fumes of this terrible language. So I was looking a little bit always, for example, I had I mean, all three of them, the main ones, because there were several others. There was Kornhauser, there were other poets read. They presented various versions of it, but the most amazing thing was that this was a voice of my generation that appeared in print, and it was a great pleasure. Alisa.
Thank you for talking about that. It's something that I think when we talk about the formal aspects, which are very important, we can also sometimes lose sight of this exact moment of discovery in the historical moment. And
because if I may add something I wanted to say, the thing that is now sounds pretentious, you know. The thing that was there on everybody's mind was to search for truth, for truth, which was also truthfulness, which was also, you know, the essence of the language, which was also, and there was still, you know, I was at the time a student. This is also the time of post-structuralism, you know, the kind of the dominance of linguistics as a way of finding the truth. So these poems were speaking, although they were coming from Poland, they were speaking towards everybody who, you know, everybody then was very much interested. And this was part of some kind of an optimistic belief that by now is lost, that something common can be found.
If I could be permitted just to make one other remark, because I think Irina just mentioned something to me that I think is at the core of why we're all here together, in fact, was that, I mean, whether it's voices like Akhmatova or much of the Polish poetry, and it's interesting that you brought up the post-structuralist moment also. I almost survived Paris during this period. I don't know if I ever managed to completely get over this sort of tyranny of post-structuralism, but that in many ways, Polish poetry has preserved and continues to preserve for the West the possibility of truth. And this is a bad word in America. I mean, truthfulness is a word
again. Please begin to do this.
This possibility, and I think this is at the core of our dialogue, and how poetry plays a role in that truth beyond convention. And it obviously misses a lot, but it has these fragments. So I want to thank you for bringing up that point.
Okay, poczekaj, Leszek, Alisa has to choose.
Can I respond?
Yeah.
Can I answer a question?
Yeah, please answer the question. Then
I don't want to cut off Leszek though. If Leszek wants to come in, this is supposed to be an open conversation, so Leszek is welcome to go ahead. I can wait with my comments.
You were next. It was your turn.
Okay. Well, there's just too much to say. And I'm always overcome with this sense. Leszek, do you want to go?
No, you should.
Okay. I just wanted to say a couple of quick things because it's really too much. Just to sort of consolidate everything that was just said, or try to wrap my head around it. It seems to me a crucial thing about Ryszard Krynicki as a poet and a person that he was not born in Poland, that he was born in a labor camp in Austria. I think this is a very kind of at the core of his identity, his sense of self and his sense of who he is as a poet. I think it's connected to his identification with other, displaced and the camp populations of the war. I mean, he was born in 1943, sort of one of the darkest years in human history. And he has embraced this in a way that I don't think any other Polish poet has. That was certainly one of the reasons I was drawn to him when I was an undergraduate. I just found Nasze Życie rośnie at random, in the library at the School of Slavonic Studies in London. And the poems were short, so I was only just learning Polish. So it was, I thought I could spell them out, with a dictionary. And that's how it began for me. I have to say that I think the two most important figures for Krynicki of the older generation are Celan and Herbert both. And he managed to combine in an extraordinary way these two very different poetic influences. And they're connected also in the sense that, Herbert and Krynicki had a kind of father-son relationship in the 70s which started out with a confrontation with Krynicki, sort of denouncing Herbert, publicly at a poetry festival for being too allegorical, for not being confrontational enough, for not rendering reality, day to day. And Herbert famously, first, in a spontaneous response, and later in this great poem to Ryszard Krynicki, a letter, gave his, I think, very rich response to this criticism, which was also criticism of Aesopian language, of allegory, of all the strategies that poets in cultures dominated by censorship resort to in order to state the truth. And the poets of '68 simply had enough of this kind of language, this detached, classical, in the sense of working through, Apollo, Hermes, and this generation, they were rebelling against that. They were rebelling against, but Krynicki's first impulse in poetry, as it seems to me from his very earliest poems, was always mystical, was always religious. And it's as if through his relationship with Herbert, which became very close, he found his way, to a kind of melding of the political impulse and this often linguistic, sort of mystical linguistic sensibility. And that's what makes him so unique, it seems to me. I don't know any other poet who combines these two things. And Herbert, in a biographical sense, also helped Krynicki, you know, who was born in Austria but only learned German later on in life, and came to Ceylon while he was on a fellowship that Herbert had you know, proposed him for in Austria. So he spent a year in Vienna, you know, studying German and reading, discovering all these poets, not just Celan, but, you know, Nelly Sachs and the whole body of that tradition. And to me, it's one of the sort of balancing acts, or one of the things that about Krunitsky's poetry that is so fascinating, that he can combine this Herbertian, you know, this drive for clarity with the complexity and the sort of mysteriousness of Celan's, you know, the reticent, veiled, metaphorical world of Celan, that in Krunitsky's poetry, you know, differently at different periods in his work, these influences come, you know, sort of float up to the surface, and then they, and it seems to me that he has, it took decades, but he then made his own, you know, unmistakable unity out of this. And to me, it's like a little like squaring the circle. I mean, this is the last thing I'll say because I could go on forever, but the reason I wanted to translate Krunitsky is because I wanted to understand what that was, there's this enigma at the heart of his poetry. And to me, it is also the enigma of poetry in its private and its public aspect. You know, how does a poet deal with that tension? Language being such a private, intimate, physical experience, and the experience of living in a community where you're seeking to share and establish some kind of common ground. And to me, that's the marvel of Krunitsky. And I have to just say that there's, you know, Claire Kavanagh should really be part of this conversation, because her book incorporates, you know, her book called Magnetic Point in English, you know, incorporates a selection of all of Krunitsky's. It's extraordinary because if you go from the beginning to the, you know, the poems that he has been writing most recently, there is a wonderful arc there. There's a, but it's unlike the arc of any poet that I know. And it has certain constants. And the question mark, I think, is one of the absolute sort of centerpieces of that poetry. So, tyle na razie.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Alisa.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alisa. So did I miss it? Well, now's Leszek's turn. But what was Herbert's response to this charge of not writing politically enough poems?
Well, this is what I'll talk about tomorrow.
Good, brilliant. Okay, Leszek.
No, just a short personal recollection, which also refers to this problem of romanticism. In 80s, I was, of course, in Poland, and at the time it was a gloomy time of martial law and so on, hopeless. And almost in every speech, General Jaruzelski quoted Norwid, very poet, quoted Norwid in every speech. I came up, I found in one of these clandestine brochure short poem by Krynicki. Każdy może cytować Norwida, Norwidowi to już nie zaszkodzi.
Translate.
Good.
Should I translate it?
Yeah, you should translate it.
Anyone can quote Norwid. It won't harm Norwid anymore.
Okay, so the moral is, of course, it didn't harm to Norwid, that hopefully Kaczynski also doesn't harm Polish.
Okay. Any Any other comments? Anyone from the audience? I don't see many faces. Yeah, Torsten, Kat Lafferty.
I'm here, but I just admire what I've been hearing, and I'm listening and learning. Thank you.
Not at all. Okay, I wanted just to make a short comment. Ages ago, after Lars' presentation, that on that line on the second poem, which was mistranslated, and I think I would recommend, like in Hannah Arendt's book on violence, there's a whole discussion about semantics. And she makes a difference between strength, power, violence, but only in English. So, and it's precisely, this mistranslation is precisely about this difference in semantic between those words. So whoever wants to translate that poem should read this short book by Hannah Arendt on violence. Okay. So, no comments anymore? No reaction? Shall we call it a day? I have someone from the audience, Kat Lafferty. You should unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Where are you talking to us from?
From New York.
Brilliant.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for sharing those beautiful verses with us, powerful. And I just wanted to, I appreciated how you went through the 4 context points to sort of help us, to lead us through the work. And I just wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit more about the potential for the use of the vocative. That was one of your points under tradition or language. Because I feel like we didn't really talk about that. And what were you thinking? Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Thank you. Thank you, Kat. I think, no, I will abstain. I don't want to say more today. Maybe we'll come back to that tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you for your comment.
There was an evocative comment on vocative. All right. All right. Thank you so much for being so wonderful, for taking part, and some of you being heroically not sleeping. And Leo, did you want to make a comment? Well, then we'll reconvene tomorrow at slightly later times. I'll send you all the link shortly, and hope the gods of internet will protect us and guide us, and no too much interruption. Well, thank you so much. It was so great. It worked out greatly. I see it but and even here, Alice, for some reasons. Well, okay.
Do jutra.
Do jutra. Do zobaczenia. Пока. До свидания. Vises. Ciao. Arrivederci. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you, Paka.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao. Have a safe trip.
See you tomorrow.
Wherever you're going. Пока. Ciao.
10 minutes by bike.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Okay.